Hello listeners, this talk is about the Brazilification endgame and why I think it will fail. What do I mean by Brazilification? Essentially I mean becoming like Brazil. Brazil is a country that has particular characteristics. It's a large country with a large population and they're quite ethnically diverse and even culturally diverse to some extent. And it's a grossly dysfunctional country in pretty much every way you can imagine. Nothing works there. There's extreme corruption, crime, poverty, very stratified and ossified divisions, class divisions and so on within the country. Pretty much nothing functions there in the way that we think of things functioning in the Anglosphere. And I mean Western nations, particularly the US, becoming more like Brazil in that regard. Now, in Brazil, the elite are quite disconnected from the people they rule. They're disconnected in pretty much every way. And we're also beginning to see that more and more with the elite in the West. They're becoming quite disconnected culturally. So the books, the movies, television, music, everything that the elite in the West consume now, those things are quite different from the sorts of things that ordinary people consume. And often the elite have next to no real understanding of what those other things are or why those other people consume them. And they also have a fair level of disdain for them. And by the same token, the middle class and the lower class in many ways have become completely disconnected from the kind of high culture that the elite consume. The average lower class and middle class person these days in the West has next to no knowledge or understanding of anything that hasn't happened within the past 5 minutes, basically. They have no understanding of history or old books, old movies, anything like that. The elite are also becoming quite distinct educationally. They all graduate high school, of course, and they almost all go on to pursue much higher degrees, not just bachelor's degrees, but master's degrees and PhDs. And also they pursue those at elite institutions, so the Ivy League universities in the US, for instance. Now some of the middle or lower class also attain such levels of education, but generally not nearly as much as the elite. And of course the elite are becoming financially or economically quite distinct from other people also. They have enough money that they don't have to worry about money, essentially. I mean, a lot of them still actually don't have that much wealth because they live quite expensive lifestyles, but nevertheless they don't really have to worry about where their money is coming from, whereas other people increasingly are struggling just to get by financially or economically. And of course the elite are also becoming quite distinct geographically. They're very urban, and they are now tending to cluster in some major cities, either regional hubs or some sort of mega cities, tending towards mega cities, because that's where the kinds of jobs that they do exist in the main. So in the US, those kinds of cities would be Washington, DC, New York City, San Francisco, perhaps Los Angeles, and maybe one or two others. But those four in particular. Likewise in Europe, they tend to be going to places like Brussels or maybe Geneva. or London primarily, maybe a handful of other European capitals, but those are the places that they tend to be clustering in because the jobs that they do, either sort of very bureaucratic jobs or working in the media or in finance, these kinds of things, that's where those jobs generally tend to be, the powerful, influential jobs. Which leads me on to mention that the elite are generally very much driven by power and prestige, and also to an extent money, though in many cases more power than money. People who go into politics or the bureaucracy or the media, academia and so on, they're probably more interested in power than money. And one of the ways in which someone can maintain or advance power or wealth is to prevent others from being able to do so. And one of the best ways to do that is to keep those other people divided amongst themselves, or to make them more base. So what we're seeing in the West is that the elite, it's not just accidental, some of it is accidental, but I don't believe it's entirely accidental by any stretch of the imagination. What we're seeing is that the elite are trying to divide people and break up their cultures, break up their ethnicity, anything that holds them together, anything that gives them a strong identity or sense of self or purpose. They're trying to break those things up. They're trying to make the culture far more base, and they're trying to split up communities along any line they can, often ethnic, but not just ethnic. Anything that's traditional, anything that's seen as being a system of power or an institution or organization that in some way threatens this new world order needs to go, or needs to be brought in line with the same values of the New World Order in order to prevent people from organizing. Because that's what this is essentially about. All of these traditions, all of these institutions and organizations, the culture basically, but also ethnicity, because people group together ethnically, these things need to be broken up because they have traditionally provided a check upon power in the West. The West, and particularly the Anglosphere, have a long tradition of being anti-tyrannical and being suspicious of those who would concentrate power. And that, all of that suspicion and the ability to check that power, that's all bound up in the culture, in the traditions and the institutions and so on. And so as long as those things exist, power, the ultimate power of these elite will be checked by those things. So therefore, in breaking them up, it allows the elite to advance their power. Now, if current trends continue, I believe we're looking at the Brazilification of much of the traditional West. Within my lifetime, in fact, not even by the end of my lifetime, I suspect within the next couple of decades, this process seems to be accelerating. If I think back to when I was in school, when I was a teenager and so on, that was 20 to 25 years ago. If I think about the incredible changes that have occurred in the West within that past 20 to 25 years, it's really, the West is almost unrecognizable these days, and it's hard to imagine that it has much left in it, that it can be recognizable in any form if we have another 20 to 25 years of that. So I believe that the West is really under threat. Now, what do I mean by the West? Well, I essentially just mean Western Europe, North America, and by North America I actually just mean Canada and the United States of America, and also Australia and New Zealand. There are other places that share things in common with the West, but I don't believe they're Western. So there are many places that are modern that are not Western. So some East Asian countries are quite modern and developed, but they are really in no way Western. They might have one or two things that could be considered Western, but overall they're not. And then there are places like Latin America, which I don't consider to be Western. I believe they followed a slightly different tradition. They're similar, but not the same. And I think this trend of Brazilification is particularly pronounced in the US, and I think it's particularly pronounced in many countries in Western Europe. It is also happening in Canada, it is also happening in Australia and New Zealand, but I believe it's slightly different. And I think that's primarily because the immigration is slightly different in those countries. For instance, the UK basically seems to have an immigration policy that goes as follows. Where are the worst people in the world? Where are the dumbest people in the world? How can we find them? How can we entice them to come here? And how can we entice as many of them as possible to come here? That seems to be the British immigration policy in a nutshell. And it doesn't seem to be too much different in places like Sweden, for instance, and to a large extent many other Western European nations. And I think it's also the case in the US as well. They don't seem to be doing anything to essentially stop their country from being flooded by the dregs of the third world. Whereas countries such as Canada, Australia and New Zealand have a better immigration policy. They still have mass immigration, which is changing those societies, but the change doesn't seem to be as dramatic because they get a higher quality of migrant simply because of their immigration policies. They have very discriminatory immigration policies. You need to get a number of points, and that is based upon education level. It's based upon certain skill shortages or profession shortages within those countries. So they don't attract someone who's completely useless, basically. They tend to attract people who are fairly productive, fairly intelligent. Those people don't then become very much of a strain upon the society. Certainly not economically in the main. They might have cultural issues, but not economic issues. So I think that those three countries in the Anglosphere are in slightly better shape. They're still on that path, but I think they're not as far down that path, and they're moving more slowly down that path, whereas some other nations are really going to be in very big trouble within the next 2 decades, I believe. And we can look at the demographic projections in those countries and really see what's going to happen in those countries as a result. Now, even aside from immigration and the effect that is having in terms of Brazilification, there's something that's occurring to the indigenous people in these countries, the white people essentially. There's a sort of a Brazilification effect occurring with those people because the lower class in particular, but also increasingly the middle class, especially as the middle class disappears, those people are both genetically and culturally becoming quite degenerate also. Genetically, in that all the wrong people are breeding. The middle class and upper middle class people aren't breeding anywhere near as much as lower class people in the West, white people in the West. And also the culture or cultures of white people in the West are becoming increasingly degenerate. I mean, look at lower class whites in the US, for instance. Many of them listen to exactly the same music. They're all into rap and so on that other people do, that a lot of other degenerates do. And their behaviour in terms of having children out of wedlock and how they raise their children and so on, they're becoming quite indistinguishable from other groups in the US. And the same in the UK. The sort of chav culture in the UK is increasingly indistinguishable from other lower class cultures or underclass cultures in the UK. White chavs I'm talking about. They're all sort of becoming this great mess of degenerates, essentially. Tattoos, all of this stuff. They're becoming omnipresent, and other than skin colour, it's almost impossible to distinguish these people now. So I believe that even without immigration, there are severe problems in terms of what's happening to the culture. Immigration is helping to give it a real push towards this Brazilification, but even without that immigration, I think there's some quite disturbing trends that are occurring. Now, of course, these new Brazils, as they are going to exist, will be incredibly dysfunctional societies in pretty much every way. They're going to be laden with crime and corruption, and there will be low social trust, and there'll be all sorts of frictional costs that go along with that. You won't be able to take it for granted that things will just work when you go to deal with the bureaucracy. My father has told me some stories about in Australia, going to a country town. They have a holiday house, and sometimes they have to do business in a larger town near that small town where they have their house. And he needs to go and sort various things out there to do with being a pensioner. And so he sometimes has to go to an office called Centrelink, and I guess it's kind of like the welfare social security office type thing. And he sort of witnesses some of the what would you call them, the clientele, the customers. I'm not sure what term you'd use for them, but the people who go there to get their benefits. And it's sort of there's sort of a vicious cycle, because the people who go there are quite rude and disrespectful and disorganised and so on, and so they interact with the people who work there and give them a hard time, and then the people who work there, anyone who's good pretty much leaves, because I imagine it would be an extremely stressful job, and you would get abuse all the time, and there would be just this bureaucracy. You'd be bogged down with all these details all the time, and those people are really combative towards the clientele, so the clientele become more combative to them, and it becomes this vicious cycle. And so then when he has to deal with them, there's all this bureaucracy involved, because they just naturally assume that the next customer is going to be a real handful, and so there's all this bureaucracy involved, and everyone's trying to cover themselves, basically. And so, he goes up there and he's polite to them and so on. But he still has to engage in all this petty red tape all the time. And that's basically, part of it is self-inflicted by the bureaucracy, but part of it is also as a safeguard when dealing with these other people. And so the whole society becomes bogged down in all these low trust interactions, all of these frictional costs, essentially. Pardon me. And that is increasingly coming to the West. Nothing will function. They won't have the funding for it either, because as this society becomes bogged down with people who can't function, and as those who are more functional get laden with all of these additional costs, that means the society is going to become economically less efficient also, and that is going to feed into a vicious cycle, a feedback loop, whereby they can't fund anything properly. Everything's always sort of in a state of general disrepair, and of course then that will increase more the frictional costs and so on, and the social the distrust between people and so on. So that's what's coming to the West, that it will become increasingly dysfunctional. And I think that both liberals and the elite, and there's a fair amount of overlap between the two, but not always. And when I talk about liberal, I'm talking about sort of non-elite liberal here. I should qualify that. So, maybe even upper middle class, but certainly below that. Your garden variety person who goes out and votes for a left-wing party or someone who is perhaps in the cathedral but not that high up in the cathedral, or social justice warriors, basically non-elite liberals. I think all of these people are completely out to lunch on this. I think they're under the mistaken assumption that society essentially consists of a set of replaceable cogs in a machine, that you can pull out this tradition and you can put in a new tradition, that you can pull out these people and put in new people, and everything will function exactly the same way as it always has. That you can take the things out of the West that have made the West great. So you can take out the culture and so on, and you can also take out the people, Western people, basically white people. You can take those out and you can replace the culture, you can replace those people, and you'll still get the successful, functional, innovative, etc., etc. United States that existed, say, 30 years ago or 50 years ago. You'll still be able to have that in the future, just not with those people and their culture. I mean, that's obviously absurd, because it stands to reason that if you replace the culture with, say, the culture of Brazil, or something similar to the culture of Brazil, or the culture of Pakistan, or something similar to the culture of Pakistan, or you replace the people with Latin Americans, or people from the Indian subcontinent, or Africa, or the Middle East, that you're going to still have something that is fundamentally American, or something that is fundamentally British, or European. That notion is obviously absurd. It doesn't make any sense that you could do that. I mean, you can't do that in any other area in life. You know, you couldn't say, I'm going to bake a cake, I want this cake to be a chocolate cake, but instead of putting chocolate in there, I'm going to put oranges in there, that it will still taste like a chocolate cake rather than an orange cake. That just doesn't stand up to any test of logic. But that's what liberals genuinely seem to believe. Some of them don't. Some of them are playing funny little games and being very Machiavellian. But many of them do actually seem to believe that, which is obviously absurd. It's simply not going to turn out that way. And I actually think that the liberals are going to be the first who really feel the effects of this, because all of the things that they love, all of the things that they always want, and the things for which they advocate, whether it's public transport or public education, welfare, healthcare, all of these things, well, those things are grossly dysfunctional in places like Brazil, or even non-existent in some places. And those things are going to be grossly dysfunctional or non-existent in the West. And these people are going to get a very, very rude shock. I mean, if you look at how people live in countries like Brazil, those who can live in gated communities, they send their kids to private schools. They have private healthcare, all of this sort of stuff, and everyone else just suffers along with whatever they can, which is usually very little. The Liberals are really out to lunch on this if they think that their wonderful socialist utopia is going to exist in any shape or form when you don't have the culture and the people to provide those institutions to set them up and run them, and to provide the funding for them and so on. It's just not going to happen. Now, I believe that ultimately these societies, these Brazil-like societies, are unsustainable. I think we'll reach some sort of high water mark probably within the next 20 years, 20 to 50 years, something like that. But I believe that within the next 20 years, maybe even sooner, we'll start to see a real blowback, real unintended consequences, at least those of the Liberals. Because it doesn't work this way historically. Multi-ethnic states, multicultural states tend to be very unstable. Some do sort of limp along, and they have periodic tensions. Some do limp along to some extent. Some even sort of merge, and new cultures, new ethnicities emerge from those. I mean, we can think, for instance, of England And England, between when the Romans left England and 1066, was a place that was very much in flux. You had all sorts of different ethnic groups there, some indigenous, the Celts were indigenous, and I guess there was some remnants of the Romans there. And then you had these waves of Anglo-Saxons and Jutes and Frisians and so on, these people from what is now the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark, and then later there were Vikings, again from Denmark, Sweden, Norway. And then, of course, the Normans, who actually were themselves originally Vikings also, who were settled in France but became French culturally. And so there was a period of flux there, and indeed there was a period of flux in Europe generally between the collapse of antiquity, essentially, the Roman Empire, and the establishment of a new order, new countries and so on. There were a lot of people moving around. Some of them merged, but most of them didn't. In the case of England, they merged, and new English culture arose from that. But generally speaking, in most places, each tribe carved out its particular area, and then eventually they became a country, and that was a process that occurred fairly early in late antiquity or the early Dark Ages. And that was more the norm than what happened in England. And that's been the norm generally all over the world, that there will be a clash between two groups of people, or maybe even more than two groups of people, but there'll be a clash between two groups of people, and one will be a winner and one will be a loser. And to the extent that they can, the winner will either drive those people out, or it will completely destroy them, or it may assimilate them, and those people will lose their cultural and linguistic identity and their religion and all of that sort of stuff. Or what happens is the two groups, if one of them can't become dominant, they will basically divide that area in two. One group will have one part, the other group will have the other part, and two new nations and distinct cultures will arise from that. And so I think that this sort of Brazilification process will ultimately come to that. I think that there will be separation between peoples, there will be conflict, all of this sort of stuff. It will be bloody, and many of these countries will not just sort of end up with a new culture, a new ethnicity arising. It will be a very dramatic and violent process that will occur. There will be a huge backlash. I believe there is a real backlash coming. I think particularly in Europe that's going to happen. In the US I think there will still be a break, but I think the Brazilification will be more complete. I don't think that will be quite the same in Europe. And I think that's largely to do with the geographic locations of the two places. Europe, to some extent, well, firstly, I should say it's there's this whole notion of nations of immigrants, and that doesn't really hold in Europe. People there don't really believe that, because immigration isn't something that only stretches back a few generations in Europe. Europe generally sorted out all of its borders, or at least its kind of ethnic borders, not necessarily its national borders, but certainly its ethnic borders. It pretty much sorted those out in the Middle Ages. By the 11th century, generally speaking, everyone knew where they stood, essentially where they were. There were some places where that wasn't quite the case. So, for instance, in the Iberian Peninsula, they were still sorting that out, and even in the Balkans, they were sorting that out. But generally speaking, in most of Europe, everyone knew where they were, who was where, pretty early on in the game, and they've had fairly stable, fairly mono-ethnic and monocultural societies ever since, generally speaking. And it's only been the past couple of generations where that has changed. So I think Europeans are still very much aware of an identity. Even within countries, large countries such as Germany or France or Italy, they still have very distinct regional identities. That's not quite the case in the US, because they have been a nation of immigrants, and so it's been more fluid and so on. And also, as I mentioned, geography has played its part. I think the US is up against it simply because it shares a land border with all of these places. Most of the immigrants, or certainly the illegal immigrants who are going to the US, are from Latin America, and there's a land border there. They can just move across by land, which is much easier than if there's a barrier that consists of a large body of water, which is the case in Europe. Now, they're not good at enforcing it, but they could be, and it would be much easier for them, I believe, because there's that natural border. Likewise, of course, with Australia, New Zealand, and even Canada, because Canada is basically fronted on two sides by water, and then its southern border is the US, which is a benign country to its south. So, they sort of, they don't really have a land border in a sense. Most of their immigrants tend to come by sea or air, really. So I think the US is actually going to find it harder to undo this process, whereas I think Europe will make quite a distinct break. And the other countries, I think they might even have time to course correct. And as I mentioned earlier, their immigration policies are much better than in other places. So I think actually America's going to be in the worst shape in terms of this Brazilification. And I think white people in certain parts of the country will try to secede. I don't know to what extent they will be successful, but I don't think they'll hang on to the US as it currently exists. To the extent that they hang on to the US, it will only be in part. Other parts will become fully Brazilified, or they will simply be annexed probably by Mexico. Whereas I think in Europe, they will actually solve this problem. But I'll talk more about that in another talk. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think Liberals are deluding themselves about how this is going to play out. I think Liberals are actually going to find themselves front and centre in all of this, because many Liberals, at least younger generations of Liberals, so those people who are SJWs, or those people who have gone to university and got an arts degree and are now working at Starbucks or something, or living with their parents, they're not going to have the economic means to really deal with this, because those people are really dysfunctional in their personal lives and with their personal finances and so on. They won't have the communities, they won't have the ability in terms of their own personal skills and so on, because those people are pretty useless. I mean, if Starbucks were closed for a day, if 7-Eleven were closed for a day or something, those people would probably starve to death. So they're not going to have the resilience to be able to deal with this, and they're also not going to be able to afford to build their own communities. Though, of course, even other white people are going to have problems because of this recent Section 8 ruling, where it's going to be very difficult to engage in white flight. Though they'll still organise and they'll still be able to be somewhat resilient, I think, your average white people, and especially those who live in the country, because other groups of people don't tend to like living in the country as much. They tend to be urban, essentially. I think Liberals are going to be in real trouble with this, and I think what's going to happen to them is, I can imagine some sort of scenario where two groups are facing off against each other. There's a sort of a group of white people, and then there's this Dindu horde, and they're ready to face off, and there are some white Liberals in the middle saying, please don't fight, and then as the Dindu horde runs towards them, because they may also be shunned by those other white people, as the Dindu horde runs towards them, they'll be shouting, "We're the good white guys. We're the good white guys. We're against racism. We advocated on your behalf. We're with you guys." And the Dindu horde won't even break stride as it runs past and kills them, and mutters under its breath, "There's no such thing as a good white person," and continues and then has their clash with the other people. I think that's what's going to happen. I think white liberals are going to have to really figure this out, that either they're probably going to be either assimilated or destroyed by other people, because those other people don't like them at all. They really don't. And they don't share the same values. I mean, look at all these sort of hipster cafes and the general hipster culture, SJW culture. I mean, you never see a Guatemalan dressed up as some anime character. You never see a black guy who's into, who has an ironic moustache or something, right? You just don't see that kind of stuff. So, this sort of white, urban, liberal culture, those guys are not going to exist. Basically, they're either going to have to figure it out and go over to shock horror over to the other white culture, or they're going to be destroyed, essentially. I think they're really deluding themselves if they think it's not going to turn out that way. Now, as to the elite, I also believe they're cutting their own throats, and I think they're going to fail in this process of Brazilification. I think they will succeed for a while, but I think there will be a big backlash against them, because even when whites won't be the majority, even when they're less than 50%, they're still going to have a particular way of thinking, and they're not going to be that compliant, that easy to manipulate. As long as they exist in anything more than a very, very small minority, 10% or something of the population, I don't believe they're actually going to put up with this Brazilification process. I think before that point, and as I mentioned earlier, I think there'll be a high water mark of all of this nonsense, maybe within the next couple of decades. Who knows? It will depend upon all sorts of things, and it may not follow the same trajectory in each country. But nevertheless, I think there'll be a high water mark, and then they'll say, no, this is it. And the elite will have real problems with those people, even if they only exist in, say, 30% of the populace. There'll be a very difficult 30% to deal with. They'll become increasingly resistant, and especially in the US, for instance, they're all armed to the teeth. The US government is going to have a real problem taking them on. Pardon me. Especially because the elite are very dependent upon the military caste to do their dirty work, and they're very dependent upon mid-level managers and all of these sorts of people in the bureaucracy, and I don't think they will actually continue to enjoy the support of those people. The military, or at least those who are involved in active duty or the frontline roles, the shooting roles, those people are incredibly white. If you go on YouTube and you look at videos, they have these videos of raw recruits in the Marine Corps. Sort of the first 30 minutes, they get off a bus, and then there's this whole process of them taking their valuables and putting them in a bag and all of this sort of stuff. I've watched some of these videos. If you look at the videos, I mean, they're all white guys. There are a handful of guys who are not white there. And I suspect also that they're all guys who are from the heartland. They're not hipsters, generally speaking. I know there might be a couple who do that, but they're all white guys from the heartlands. They're all from Kansas. They're all from Idaho. They're all from Alabama. They're not a hipster from Manhattan or from Los Angeles or something. And those people, I don't think they're going to support the elite, because let's say, for instance, there's the heartland rises up against this and says we've had enough. So the elite sends the military out to deal with them, and you see a whole bunch of white rebels ready to face off against the military, and then the military are there, and they look at each other, and your average soldier thinks, hang on a second, that guy looks like my cousin, or he says, hang on, I'm from Kansas. Why are we here ready to fight people from Kansas? I'm from Kansas, right? they're not going to do it. I really don't think they're going to do it. Are they going to shoot at someone who looks like their cousin, their neighbour, their brother, their classmate, their high school classmate, that kind of thing? I don't think they're going to do that. They're going to say, no, the elite are the guys who are wrong here. And I think the elite are going to lose legitimacy, because every society needs to enjoy, every elite needs to enjoy legitimacy. They need to enjoy the consent of the government, of the governed, should I say. It doesn't matter what sort of form of government there is. It could be a democracy, it could be something that's sort of a limited republic, it could be a theocracy, a monarchy, you name it. Outside of a complete dictatorship, and even then it's difficult to get away with it for too long, they need to have the consent of the governed, and they're not going to have the consent of the governed. Even in situations like, you might think of the mandate of heaven in China, that concept, thinking that was top down, it was really bottom up, because if you were a tyrannical emperor, eventually people would rise up against you. There'd be some sort of peasant uprising or something like that, or maybe one of your ministers would see an opening. And if this uprising was successful, you would get deposed, you would lose the mandate of heaven, and it was always applied sort of in retrospect that you had lost the mandate of heaven, and the new person would have the mandate of heaven if he succeeded. If he failed, then he wouldn't, of course, but he would have the mandate of heaven if he succeeded, and he would declare himself the new emperor. And it takes that form everywhere in the world. They need to have the support of the people below them, and I simply don't think that's going to be the case with the white populace, the traditional people, whether it's in Europe or North America. Even if they're minorities, they'd have to be a very, very small minority for them not to be a problem for the elite. And they're not going to be only 10% of the population within the next century. They're still going to be 30, 40, 50 or more percent. Even in some places there'll be a majority still, but even when they're a minority, they'll still be 30% or 40% of the populace. And that's enough to cause some real problems, especially because they tend to be smarter, they tend to be better organised and so on than other groups of people. They're just more functional in every way, obviously, because they're the people who have created these functional societies that are becoming dysfunctional, and they're becoming dysfunctional to the extent that they're becoming less like they were, whether culturally or genetically. So those remnants of that old way and those old genes, those people are still going to be very smart, very organised, and they're going to be a real problem for the elite. Now, the elite may think that, they can go into some bunkers or something, but even still, they would still require support staff to aid them in that. And I don't think they're going to do that. I don't think the support staff are going to support them in essentially saying, yeah, okay, you can go in a bunker and maybe you'll let me come in as well, but my extended family back in Kansas, they can all go and burn in hell. Yeah, I'll play along with that. That would work. They're not going to do that. Or they may think that they can flee. Now, even if they think they can flee, that will represent a massive decline in their power. They might still have some wealth, they might flee with some wealth, but whenever we see that occur in other places, when one group flees to another country after there's a big political upheaval, as to the extent that they exist in that new country, many of them are sort of in limbo. Some of their children, because they may have had very good educations and they have money behind them, some of them will rise up to occupy positions of power within the new society, though generally not right at the top, perhaps at a mid-level somewhere. They may be businessmen, or they may be low-level politicians or bureaucrats, academics and so on, but they tend not to rise right to the top. But most don't. Most end up sort of frittering away any capital, whether in terms of money or sort of social capital, cultural capital that their parents had. You know, they do the cocktail circuit, they become playboys, all of this kind of stuff, and it's all gone within a couple of generations. They've disappeared to within the ranks of everyone else within that society. I mean, the elites that exist in the country to which other people flee, they're not going to just allow a new elite to come in and say, yeah, okay, we'll displace some of our own so that you can have positions of power. They don't do that. They, you know, as I said, they'll do the cocktail circuit with them, and you know, it's all laughs and it's all very friendly and so on. But they still never let those people really get completely into the club. They don't do that, generally speaking. As I said, their descendants may work their way up through that later on, but the first and second generation don't tend to get admitted into the club, the elite club in the new country. So even if the elite think they're going to be able to flee, I don't know where they think they would flee to. I mean, they're not going to, you know, if the West in general has these problems, then there's going to be nowhere to run in the West. Or maybe they'll flee to Canada or Australia or something. But, you know, those places don't have large populations, and they don't have large populations of their own elite. So I don't really think that would be too viable for them. And they're certainly not going to be able to flee to China or India or somewhere like that. The Chinese elite are not going to let a bunch of white elite move in and displace them. They probably wouldn't even let white refugees of any kind into their country, let alone the elite. Or as I said, to the extent that they do, they'll do the cocktail circuit with them, and that will be it, more or less. They'll keep them on as some sort of little curiosity at best. So I really think that's where it's all heading. I think it will reach a high water mark within probably the next 20 years. There'll be a lot of fallout, and of course picking up the pieces after the fallout will be a really arduous task, and it will have really severe consequences upon the West. Whether various Western countries break apart, or you know, some of them may sort of become melting pots, but most of them won't. And even to the extent that countries may just deport people or may, you know, expel them in some way, they're still going to have to pick up the pieces of the past 50 to 100 years. And that won't be a pretty process either. But nevertheless, I think ultimately this Brazilification endgame is going to fail in the West. So thanks for listening.